The prospect of maintaining a razor-sharp memory well into the later decades of life is not merely a stroke of genetic luck, but a biological possibility that remains dormant in many adults. A prevailing myth suggests that the brain inevitably calcifies after age 25, losing its capacity to rewire or generate new connections as the years accumulate toward 50 and beyond. This misconception leads many to accept cognitive decline, slower recall, and reduced focus as unavoidable consequences of aging rather than treating them as physiological states that can be altered. Andrew Huberman posits that the neural mechanisms for plasticity remain intact throughout the entire lifespan, waiting only for the specific chemical and behavioral keys to unlock them. By leveraging specific protocols that govern neurochemistry, the aging individual can not only halt regression, but actively expand the brain's functional capacity. This journey requires shifting focus from passive brain training games to the fundamental biological levers of alertness, focus, and rest that physically restructure the nervous system. The neurochemical gateway to adult plasticity, the adult brain, differs significantly from the child brain in its resistance to change, a protective mechanism designed to preserve the knowledge and skills acquired over decades of experience. For a person over 50 to trigger the neuroplasticity required for memory enhancement, specific neurochemical gates must be forcibly opened through precise behavioral states. Andrew Huberman emphasizes that passive engagement is insufficient for the mature nervous system to mark neural circuits for upgrading. The process begins with the release of norepinephrine, a chemical associated with alertness and agitation, which signals to the brain that an event is significant enough to warrant attention. This creates a state of high-contrast alert, distinguishing the learning moment from the background and noise of daily routine. Without this initial spike in arousal, the brain defaults to its efficient, habitual pathways, rendering any attempt at learning new information transient and biologically ineffective. Once alertness is established, the second critical component involves the cholinergic system, specifically the release of acetylcholine from the nucleus basalis in the forebrain. This neurotransmitter acts as a spotlight, narrowing the individual's focus onto a specific sensory input or thought pattern while suppressing irrelevant data. For the aging brain, the ability to sustain this spotlight often weakens not due to incapacity, but due to a lack of rigorous practice in narrowing the visual and mental field. The combination of high alertness and narrow focus marks specific synapses for strengthening, a process that does not occur during casual reading or passive listening. The discomfort or mental strain felt during this period of intense focus is not a sign of failure, but the sensation of the cholinergic system engaging the machinery of plasticity. A practical application of this mechanism involves dedicating strictly timed blocks to learning a new, cognitively demanding skill, such as a complex motor movement or a foreign language syntax. The individual should engage in this activity for distinct periods, aiming specifically for the point of frustration where errors occur frequently. It is the error signal, the gap between what the brain predicts and what actually happens, that triggers the release of the necessary neurochemicals to tag those neural circuits for change. If the task is too easy or familiar, acetylcholine is not released in sufficient quantities, and the brain relies on established, efficient maps rather than creating new ones. Therefore, the feeling of agitation during the attempt to learn is the necessary physiological trigger that the brain requires to initiate structural remodeling. However, a common limitation arises when the individual misinterprets this physiological agitation as stress or inability, leading to premature cessation of the effort. The aging individual often prioritizes comfort and competence, avoiding the very sensation of limbic friction that signals the brain is ready to change. It is crucial to understand that neuroplasticity in adulthood is an active, metabolically expensive process that the brain will not undertake without a compelling neurochemical reason. By reframing the sensation of strain as the entry point for neuroplasticity, the individual can push through the initial barrier of resistance. This shift in perspective transforms the learning process from a test of intelligence into a deliberate manipulation of the brain's chemical environment. Furthermore, the visual system plays a surprisingly dominant role in controlling these states of alertness and focus for memory retention. Narrowing visual focus to a single point for 30 to 60 seconds can recruit the neural circuitry responsible for cognitive focus, acting as a warm-up for the brain. Conversely, widening the gaze to panoramic vision helps to quell the stress response if the agitation becomes counterproductive, balancing the autonomic nervous system. Andrew Huberman suggests that leveraging the eyes to control the brain offers a direct line of access to deep brain centers that are otherwise difficult to influence consciously. By mastering the transition between vergence and movements for focus and panoramic vision for relaxation, the person gains manual control over the arousal states necessary for learning. The timing of these focus bouts is equally critical, as the adult brain has a limited capacity for the high-energy demands of cholinergic release. Shorter, more intense bursts of focused effort are often more effective than prolonged, diluted sessions that fail to maintain the necessary chemical threshold. The goal is to generate a high volume of error signals followed by successful corrections within a compressed time frame, maximizing the density of the learning event. This density signals to the nervous system that the new information is critical for survival or success, prioritizing it for long-term storage. By respecting the biological limits of focus while pushing the boundaries of effort, the individual optimizes the conditions for memory encoding. Ultimately, the process of triggering plasticity is about overcoming the brain's natural inertia and preference for energy conservation. The adult brain is a record of the past, and changing it requires a neurochemical event that contradicts the status quo of established neural connections. By strategically deploying alertness and focus and embracing the discomfort of error, the individual forces the nervous system to adapt. This proactive approach treats memory not as a fading storage bank, but as a dynamic structure that is perpetually responsive to the demands placed upon it. Am I avoiding the mental strain that signals my brain to grow? Harnessing dopamine to overcome limbic friction. The greatest barrier to establishing memory-boosting habits in later life is often not a lack of capability, but the presence of limbic friction, the immense neural energy required to overcome inertia. As the brain ages, the circuits responsible for reflexive, habitual behavior become deeply entrenched, making the initiation of new, beneficial behaviors energetically expensive. Andrew Huberman identifies dopamine not merely as a molecule of pleasure, but as the primary driver of motivation and the universal currency of foraging and effort. For the individual over 50, the dopamine system must be retrained to reward the effort process itself rather than focusing solely on the external outcome. This shift is essential because relying on the distant promise of better memory is often insufficient to mobilize the body against the immediate comfort of sedentary routines. The mechanism of reward prediction error dictates that dopamine is released in response to an unexpected positive outcome or the anticipation of a known reward. However, if the reward is too delayed or abstract, the brain fails to release the dopamine necessary to sustain the effort, leading to a loss of motivation. To counteract this, the individual must learn to subjectively attach a dopamine reward to the sensation of friction and effort in the moment. This cognitive reframing, telling oneself that the struggle is the beneficial part, can eventually tether dopamine release to the act of striving. By doing so, the person transforms the barrier of limbic friction into a signal to proceed, creating a self-sustaining loop of motivation that does not depend on immediate external validation. In a practical scenario, consider the resistance an individual feels when attempting to start a complex memory exercise or a vigorous bout of exercise in the morning. The body feels heavy, and the mind generates rationalizations to delay or skip the activity entirely, a state of high limbic friction. Instead of waiting for motivation to strike, the individual can use a behavioral wedge, such as exposure to morning sunlight or a brief cold shower, to forcibly spike catecholamines. This external increase in dopamine and adrenaline provides the neurochemical fuel needed to override the limbic system's hesitation, allowing the prefrontal cortex to take command. Once the activity has begun, the individual consciously acknowledges the victory of starting, reinforcing the neural pathway that overcomes hesitation. A significant mistake often made is the reliance on dopamine stacking, or layering multiple sources of reward such as music, stimulants, and entertainment to make a task bearable. While this may facilitate the activity in the short term, it ultimately raises the baseline requirement for stimulation, making the task itself feel boring and unrewarding in isolation. Huberman warns that overlaying rewards can lead to a crash in motivation when those external supports are removed or lose their novelty. A more sustainable approach for the aging brain is to occasionally perform the difficult habit with no external distractions, allowing the brain to derive satisfaction from the intrinsic completion of the task. This resets the dopamine threshold and preserves the ability to find engagement in subtler, quieter activities that are crucial for memory work. There are moments when the biological machinery for motivation is simply depleted and no amount of psychological framing can overcome the deficit. In such cases, the body's ultradian rhythms, 90-minute cycles of alertness and rest, must be respected to avoid burnout and frustration. Attempting to force high-demand cognitive work during a naturally occurring trough in energy results in poor performance and in negative association with the habit. By mapping the most demanding memory tasks to the times of day when natural alertness is highest, usually mid-morning or late afternoon, the individual works with their biology rather than against it. This alignment ensures that the limited dopamine reserves are spent when the brain is most receptive to engagement. The anterior mid-cingulate cortex is a brain region that is particularly sensitive to the act of doing things that one does not want to do. Engaging in tasks that generate high friction but are ultimately beneficial has been shown to maintain or even grow the volume of this brain area, which is linked to the will to live and tenacity. For the person over 50, exercising this willpower muscle is as vital as exercising the cardiovascular system, as it preserves the agency required to navigate the challenges of aging. Every time the individual successfully overrides the impulse to quit, they're physically reinforcing the neural structures that support longevity and cognitive resilience. Understanding the temporal dynamics of dopamine also allows for better management of disappointment and failure during the learning process. If an individual expects a memory task to be easy and fails, the resulting drop in dopamine is profound and demotivating, often leading to abandonment of the protocol. By anticipating difficulty and framing the struggle as a necessary component of the process, the dopamine crash is mitigated. This management of expectation prevents the neurochemical penalty that follows unmet predictions, keeping the individual in the game long enough to see results. Is my need for immediate comfort dismantling my long-term capacity? Cardiovascular mechanics of hippocampal expansion, the connection between the heart and the brain, is often underestimated in discussions of memory. Yet aerobic capacity is arguably the most potent lever for maintaining neural volume. The hippocampus, the brain's primary center for memory formation and consolidation, is notoriously susceptible to atrophy as age progresses, shrinking by a small percentage each year in sedentary adults. Andrew Huberman highlights that this decline is not inevitable, but can be arrested and even reversed through specific modes of physical movement. The mechanism is not merely about improved circulation, but involves the release of osteocalcin from bones and the production of brain-derived neurotrophic factor, often described as fertilizer for neurons. These signaling molecules travel from the body to the brain, directly stimulating the growth of new neurons in the dentate gyrus of the hippocampus. To maximize these neurotrophic effects, the individual must engage in Zone 2 cardio, a specific intensity of exercise where one can maintain a conversation but with noticeable effort. This level of exertion is sufficient to increase blood flow and oxygenation to the brain without generating the high levels of cortisol associated with extreme physical stress. For the aging individual, consistent accumulation of Zone 2 exercise, totaling approximately 150 to 180 minutes per week, creates a systemic environment that supports neural maintenance. This is not about athletic performance, but about creating the vascular infrastructure required to deliver glucose and oxygen to metabolic-hungry neurons. Without this vascular support, even the most advanced cognitive strategies will fail due to a lack of fuel at the cellular level. A powerful applied scenario involves combining this physical state with cognitive navigation to further stimulate the hippocampus. The hippocampus evolved largely to help organisms navigate physical space, remembering locations of food and danger. Therefore, taking a walk or a hike in a novel environment where the individual must pay attention to the path activates the memory centers more robustly than walking on a treadmill while watching a screen. The act of generating forward motion while visually scanning the horizon and orienting the body in space creates a dual demand on the nervous system. This ancestral signaling reinforces the survival value of memory, encouraging the brain to allocate resources to spatial and episodic retention. However, a critical limitation exists for those who assume that sporadic, high-intensity workouts can replace consistent, moderate movement. The benefits of exercise on memory are cumulative and depend on the regular bathing of the brain in neurotrophic factors over months and years. Occasional intense bursts followed by days of sedentarism do not provide the steady signal required for tissue maintenance and can sometimes lead to injury or excessive fatigue in older adults. The protocol demands consistency over intensity, prioritizing the frequency of blood flow elevation to keep the signaling pathways active. It is the regularity of the signal that convinces the brain that the hippocampus is still a vital organ for daily survival. Glucose regulation also plays a pivotal role in this dynamic, as the hippocampus is particularly sensitive to fluctuations in blood sugar. Insulin resistance, common in aging populations, impairs the brain's ability to utilize glucose, leading to cognitive fog and memory lapses. By using muscle contractions during exercise to soak up excess blood glucose independent of insulin, the individual stabilizes the fuel supply to the brain. This stabilization prevents the toxic spikes and crashes that damage small blood vessels and impair neuronal function. Thus, the muscles act as a sink for glucose and a pharmacy for the brain, regulating the internal environment to be conducive to cognitive health. The integration of load-bearing exercise adds another layer of benefit through the skeletal system's endocrine function. When long bones are subjected to weight, they release signals that cross the blood-brain barrier and influence memory centers. This suggests that frailty is a direct risk factor for cognitive decline, not just a physical liability. By maintaining muscle mass and bone density through resistance training, the individual protects the brain from the shrinking signals associated with a sedentary existence. The physical body essentially communicates its viability to the central nervous system, prompting the brain to remain robust. It is essential to view the body not as a vessel for the head, but as the primary input device that dictates the brain's structural integrity. The separation of mental health from physical conditioning is a fallacy that is particularly dangerous in the second half of life. By treating movement as a cognitive prescription, the individual takes direct control over the biological machinery of memory. The brain waits for signals from the body to determine whether to grow or decay, and movement is the loudest signal available. Do I view my daily movement as a request for my brain to stay young? Deep rest and the architecture of consolidation, the popular conception of learning assumes that memory is formed during the act of studying or practicing, but the biological reality is that neural wiring occurs exclusively during deep rest. Andrew Huberman asserts that the neuroplasticity triggered by focus and agitation is merely the marking of the site. The actual construction and strengthening of synapses happen during sleep and non-sleep deep rest. For the individual over 50, sleep architecture often fragments, with a reduction in slow-wave sleep and REM cycles, which directly compromises the brain's ability to consolidate new information. Therefore, mastering the art of rest is as active and disciplined a pursuit as the training itself, serving as the essential counterbalance to the friction of learning. A powerful tool for reclaiming lost sleep efficiency is the protocol of non-sleep deep rest, or NSDR, which includes practices like Yoga Nidra. This involves lying still and systematically directing attention through the body, slowing the heart rate, and shifting the brain into theta wave states that mimic the boundary between wakefulness and sleep. A 20-minute session of NSDR has been shown to replenish dopamine reserves in the basal ganglia and accelerate neuroplasticity by facilitating the replay of neural firing patterns. For the aging individual who may struggle with 8 hours of continuous sleep, integrating NSDR provides a manual override to access these restorative states during the day. It allows the nervous system to decompress and process the metabolic waste products that accumulate during cognitive exertion. The glymphatic system, the brain's waste clearance mechanism, becomes highly active during these deep rest states, washing away proteins like beta amyloid that can clutter neural function. This cleansing process is critical for preventing the inflammatory conditions that stifle memory and cognition in later years. When an individual deprives themselves of sleep or relies on sedatives that induce unconsciousness but not true natural sleep, this cleaning cycle is disrupted. Huberman emphasizes that naturalistic sleep, supported by viewing morning sunlight and avoiding bright lights in the evening, is the foundation upon which all other cognitive tools rest. Without the circadian alignment that dictates the release of melatonin and cortisol, the brain lacks the temporal cues to initiate repair. A common failure mode is the belief that one can catch up on rest or that resting is a sign of low productivity. In the context of neuroplasticity, rest is the productivity. It is the phase where the acquisition of skill is cemented. The anxiety surrounding sleep, worrying about not sleeping enough, further spikes cortisol, which inhibits the very relaxation mechanisms needed for sleep onset. By utilizing NSDR protocols when sleep is elusive, the individual can reduce the sympathetic arousal attached to insomnia. This decoupling of anxiety from wakefulness preserves the brain's ability to function and reduces the cognitive penalty of a bad night. The goal is to maximize the depth and quality of rest phases, ensuring the brain has the resources to execute the blueprints created during the day. The synthesis of these principles reveals a cyclical lifestyle where high-friction effort is rhythmically balanced with profound, deliberate relaxation. The supereger does not rely on genetic lottery, but on a structured cadence of alertness, focus, movement, and recovery. By manually operating the levers of light, temperature, movement, and attention, the individual moves from being a passenger in their own biology to becoming its pilot. The decline of memory is often less about the inevitability of cell death and more about the cessation of the signals that command cell life. Ultimately, the brain requires a clear, unambiguous signal that it is needed for the future. Through the strategic application of error-driven learning, dopaminergic reframing, blood flow, enhancing movement, and restorative deep rest, the aging individual provides that signal. The capacity to learn and remember is not a vessel that empties with time, but a fire that must be stoked with specific fuels. By adopting these protocols, the narrative of aging shifts from one of loss to one of deliberate, maintained vitality. What vital recovery process am I sacrificing for the sake of staying busy?